since I've actually kind of gone back and read this paper. So it's kind of always fun to reflect on what you argued a year ago. My name is Rachel McGovern. I'm a PhD student at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So I'll be presenting a paper titled The Narrative Policy Framework and Institutions. It was a paper that was published last May in Review of Policy Research, and it's co-authored with Dr. Michael Jones. Mike sadly isn't here today, but if you have specific questions for him, I'm happy to kind of relay those to him later. So I guess a little disclaimer about what this paper is. So this paper is actually the first chapter of my dissertation. And so the goal of this paper was to really just start to theorize what an institutional narrative is and kind of what that relationship looks like between institutions and narratives. And so this is kind of the beginning piece of my broader dissertation. And there's a lot of kind of advising that Mike did on this paper of kind of helping guide that theoretical argument. So and kind of theorizing what an institutional narrative is, we really integrated the NPF with the IAD. So really we were integrating it with the institutional grammar tool, but we kind of draw some IAD kind of general insights in our rationale for kind of justifying institutional narratives. So kind of with all of that said, this paper is fully theoretical. So there's no empirics in this paper, but I am kind of currently working on testing some of these ideas. And I'll speak a little bit to that at the end of kind of what the next steps are and kind of what I'm doing and what I'm looking for. And so at that point, if anyone has commentary or questions or potential kind of helpful insights, that would be very much appreciated as I'm kind of trying to finalize that coding process. So kind of an introduction. So research on institutions has shown us that institutions are these underlying kind of components or structures of human behavior. They're kind of this inevitable feature of kind of human and social structure. And then research on narrative has kind of shown us that narratives are foundational to human cognition. They're really, really important when it comes to shaping kind of cultural identity, identifying norms, and for the policy process world, they're really important in decision making. So we kind of have these two bodies of scholarship in kind of the policy process community. One that kind of speaks to the importance of narratives, one that speaks to the importance of institutions, but we don't have very much interaction between the two bodies of literature. So Sabatier noted this in 1999, where he said that narratives and institutional analysis are often kind of following these distinct analytical pathways, but they rarely intersect and they hardly ever speak to each other. And so kind of my overarching question in my dissertation, but in this paper to some extent, is if these narratives are these kind of underlying components of human behavior, are they therefore an underlying component of kind of institutional structures? And if so, kind of what are the narrative foundations of institutions? What are their functions? What are their purposes within institutions? And do they function differently at different levels of analysis? So to kind of start exploring this question, what this paper does is it starts to kind of look at synergy between the IAD and the NPF. So we kind of start to define what an institutional narrative is, kind of tease out that definition. And then we are trying to kind of carve a pathway for how we could start looking at this. So how can we empirically study institutional narratives, and how can we link kind of these narratives that we know are important for conveying kind of shared meanings and beliefs to kind of the outcome or the creation of institutional structures and institutional roles. So I will note here that we are not the first people to do this, that there's kind of been an uptick in interest in institutional narratives recently. Dunlap and colleagues published a paper in 2021 that merged the NPF with the institutional grammar tool. And we lean into that piece a lot in this paper. And then recently, Esposito and colleagues published an article, I guess it was a few months back now, and they published their paper that was kind of building off of some of Dunlap's arguments, but their paper sadly came out after this paper was finished. So we don't engage in their arguments here, but we definitely want to note that they are important and they're very relevant to this conversation. So this is where I'll give my disclaimer. I'm an NPF scholar. Mike is obviously a very good NPF scholar. And so we came at this from the lens of the NPF. So rather than kind of directly coming through the lens of the institutional grammar, we were looking at it from a really narrative perspective. So a lot of this is kind of grounded in NPF assumptions. So kind of given this audience, I'll give a little background on some of the key assumptions that we are working off of in this paper. So the NPF is founded on the Homo neurons model of the individual, which kind of assumes that people and humans prefer to think, reason, and communicate in story form. And we also assume that narratives are social constructions. So they're not random. They're socially constructed and bounded by ideologies, belief systems, norms, and institutional roles. Now, the point about institutional roles has been referenced a few times within NPF scholarship, but it hasn't really been studied. And so we know that institutional context matters for how we create and structure narratives, but we don't really know what the extent of that is. And so we're kind of trying to address that to some extent. The NPF also takes kind of this structuralist approach to narratives, meaning we take kind of this generalizable structure that can transcend different contexts, different narratives, and that we see kind of in all narratives across time and space. And so in doing that, we kind of break narratives down into narrative form and narrative content. So narrative form is kind of what's been the most readily studied, and that's characters, setting, plot, and moral of the story. So these narrative elements are what exist in all narratives, that they're generalizable. They kind of present the same way in all stories. So these are some things that we will see in pretty much every narrative we look at. Narrative content is something that is starting to be explored and kind of developed more. So we know policy narratives are socially constructed, and they emerge from the context in which they're being defined or kind of spoken. And so because of that, there is context-dependent content within a narrative. And so it's hard to generalize that, but we know that certain patterns exist. We know that belief systems are something that we see a lot in narrative content, and we know narrative strategies are really important when we kind of look at what these narratives do. And so I can speak to more of these narrative elements in the Q&A if people have kind of questions on what those look like and kind of how we theorize it in relationship to this paper. And then lastly, the NPF kind of works off these three levels of analysis. So micro, kind of that individual level. So the individual narratives or the individuals who are consuming the narratives. And then we have meso, which is kind of the system, the subsystem or kind of coalition level. And then we have macro narratives, which are the broad institutional kind of cultural narratives. And that's really where we're grounding kind of our arguments in this paper. So the NPF has traditionally kind of viewed macro narratives as like this big overarching lens, right? These are the things that kind of exist for long periods of time. There's the narratives that transcend all sorts of settings. They define the lower level narratives, but we haven't really studied macro narratives very well. And we have kind of competing definitions or competing kind of approaches to how we go about empirically studying macro narratives. But what we know for institutional narratives is this is probably the most intuitive place to start. So kind of the well-accepted definition is that a macro narrative is an expansive narrative that transcends multiple subsystems and remains stable over time. And we kind of know that the role of macro narratives is to create and regulate the channels through which micro and meso narratives move. So they really kind of set the parameters of what an allowable narrative is or how these narratives are kind of created. And there's two approaches to macro narratives. So there's the institutional approach, which focuses on narratives from specific organizations like the US Congress or the presidency. And then there's the cultural approach, which is really kind of more of the qualitative approach, which is really focusing on like collective experiences and beliefs. Usually this has some kind of like historical narrative analysis or cultural framing study that's done. So one of the current challenges for the NPF is one, we kind of have a rough working definition, but there's still some contention if that's the right definition. But really, we don't actually know how to measure macro narratives. We don't really know how to go about doing kind of these large NPF studies where we start to kind of code and capture macro narratives. Stauffer offered one of the most robust models for macro narrative. And what she did is she said that macro narratives are basically kind of the defining story form. So she said that a macro narrative is a policy paradigm when we have an institutional narrative and a cultural narrative that collide. So if both institutions and cultures maintain the same narrative, then we will have a policy paradigm. And so she kind of puts this call out to the NPF scholarship that we need a better empirical framework to start studying this. We know that they matter. They produce these policy paradigms, but we actually don't know how to go about studying an institutional or a cultural narrative. So Holly Peterson is actually one of the first people to really start looking at and empirically studying an institutional narrative. So this is kind of where we start our grounding of kind of the theories behind institutional narratives. So she was really looking at it through the lens of kind of these macro political institutions, really Congress and the US presidency. So in her article, she introduced this idea of narrative attention theory, which what she was doing was kind of bridging the NPF with punctuated equilibrium theory, kind of through the ideas of policy image. And basically what she was arguing that attention is likely the driving mechanism for policy change in institutions. So she said that institutions have these stable policy preferences. And so we're probably not going to see narrative persuasion. What we'll actually see is narrative attention. And what narrative attention does is it functions differently in institutions. So it mobilizes existing preferences. We're probably not going to change someone's preferences or change an institution's preferences, but a narrative can activate previously existing preferences. And so this is really suggesting that, one, narratives do matter for institutions, and two, they matter for changing institutions. So she kind of starts to tease out how and why certain institutional change might occur and how narrative could be kind of that driving mechanism for why we see certain institutional change. But what Holly does is she really takes this like bottom-up approach. So she's looking at institutional narratives from the lens of like meso level narratives that are kind of processing information and kind of signaling to macro political institutions. So she's really looking at bottom up. What we don't know right now is what that relationship is from the top down. So how do these kind of top down effects play out in an institutional setting? How do institutions resist change? How do they reinforce their structure through narrative? And so that kind of leads to the key question in this paper. So informally, what Holly does is she kind of begins to establish that connections between narratives and institutional stability. And while we know these institutions are like these enduring regularities that resist change, Peterson suggests that narratives could actually be powerful enough to cause change within these enduring regularities. And so the kind of flip side of that argument is, well, if they're powerful enough to cause institutional change, surely they're powerful enough to reinforce existing structure and resist change, right? So can narratives also act as tools for stabilization? And can these narratives kind of reinforce the existing institutional structures and uphold the status quo? And then kind of the second point that we bring up in this paper from Holly's work is she takes that bottom-up approach. So we know attention probably matters at other levels of analysis, so the meso and micro level. But we kind of say, well, we know institutions don't always have to function at these macro political levels, that institutions are not limited to those macro political structures. They can be informal, they can be small in scale, they can be a bit transcendent across different political structures. And so an institutional narrative might not just be a macro narrative question, that an institutional narrative is probably something that operates at a different level of analysis. And so we may be kind of impeding on our knowledge of what an institutional narrative is because we're only looking at it from this macro scale. And so this is kind of what justifies our rationale for leaning into the IAD. So to kind of start thinking about how institutional narratives work and how they might kind of reinforce institutional structure, we turn to the IAD because it's one of the most robust in telling us kind of how we define and study institutions. So we're really looking at institutional stability and how narratives can kind of reinforce that institutional stability. The IAD allows us to do that because of the empirical kind of framework that it operates under. And to the point of kind of institutional narratives being based in their own level of analysis, IAD kind of gives us a way to look at it from the 4 different levels of analysis. So that meta-constitutional, constitutional, collective choice level. So we argue in this paper that institutional narratives probably function at all 4 levels here. And we put that in a footnote, so probably not many people see it, but we kind of argue that we should take a new lens of analysis when we think about what constitutes as an institutional narrative. And then kind of another rationale for leaning into the IAD is the NPF is really, really good at identifying independent variables. We can like pull out these different narrative elements, but we're not so good at identifying dependent variables. And so the institutional or the IAD is really good at looking at dependent variables, right? They're really good at identifying institutional roles. And so we thought that there might be some synergy going on between these independent variables and these dependent variables and how we could maybe see a connection to how these narrative elements may lead to certain kind of role outcomes. In this paper, we don't theorize too much about like the general IAD framework in the NPF. We really lean into the institutional grammar. So we look a little bit at kind of the role typology, but we're really focusing on ADICO. And we kind of argue that ADICO, kind of given that syntactic approach to institutional statements, complements kind of the NPF's approach to coding narratives. Both of them look at the actual content within a statement, right? So ADICO is looking at the actual institutional statements that are published or produced. NPF does the same. We're looking at the actual words within documents. And so from an empirical lens, we're studying the same thing kind of similarly. And so there's kind of that natural overlap in how we could go about looking at that. So kind of moving towards a theory of institutional narrative. So we don't really propose a theory here. We kind of just look at what that might kind of look like as we start to develop that. So when we kind of start thinking about a theory of institutional narratives, we really leaned into Dunlap's work. And what they did in their piece is they integrated the NPF with the institutional grammar. And one of their big contributions was they mapped narrative elements onto the role types. So they were really connecting and trying to draw lines between NPF elements to certain role outcomes. So, for example, they looked at how the narrative setting might be attributed to the attributes of a community. They linked characters to boundary roles, position roles, and choice roles. And they argued that like new characters could represent an aggregation role, and a payoff role is the plot. So they kind of started drawing these connections between the different elements. And one of their big contributions that we liked in this paper was they argued that NPF scholars could really benefit from the institutional grammar's kind of structure because it allows us to see what characters in a narrative actually do, right? So it's drawing that kind of connection to a dependent variable or kind of this outcome. Instead of just looking at what these characters are, we could connect it to some kind of outcome within the policy process. And so that directly spoke to kind of our concerns about the NPF's lack of ability to kind of look at these outcomes of narrative formation. So one of the things, though, that we kind of came to when we were looking at Dunlap's piece was they were really focused on narrative form. And narrative form is those like traditional NPF elements like characters, setting, plot, and moral of the story, which makes sense because those are kind of the backbone or like the general structure of a narrative. But in kind of focusing on that, they ended up omitting narrative content. And so that's like the omission of things like ideology, belief systems, kind of those deeper contextual meanings that we derive from the actual content within a narrative. And we felt like this was kind of a big omission because a lot of micro level studies tell us that that's really, really important when it comes to narrative effects, that those are sometimes the most influential kind of driving forces. And so by leaving that out in kind of our theorization of institutional narratives, we might be missing a big point or kind of a big contribution for what could be the driving force of a narrative within an institutional kind of framework. And so what we do in this paper is we start to kind of theorize where narrative content might fit. And when we started to think about this, we actually leaned into ADICO. They worked off of the role typology. We really worked off of ADICO because we thought that that might be kind of a good place to start to really dive into the content of statements and narratives. And so what we did is we started to put ADICO next to the NPF. So we were trying to see if there was patterns or overlaps where ADICO components were interacting or doing the same thing that NPF elements were doing. And so the most obvious one was ADICO's attributes, so an NPF character. So in ADICO, the attribute part specifies who's involved or affected by an institutional statement. And in the NPF, that's pretty much what characters do. They tell us who's being affected by a policy problem. They tell us if someone's solving it, if someone's causing it. And so there's like this really clear overlap in kind of the defining roles and rights and responsibilities when it comes to attributes and characters. And then the next clear overlap we saw was between aim and moral of the story. So the aim really describes what action is allowed, what's required, what's forbidden, basically what needs to be done. Moral of the story does the exact same thing in a narrative, right? It tells us what the policy solution might be. It tells us what actions need to be taken. Sometimes it highlights an outcome that we would like to see. So it makes sense, again, that we see this overlap in these two components and elements. And then the connection between condition was really drawn between condition and setting and plot. So the condition part of ADICO really specifies when, where, and under what circumstances actions apply. That's what setting and plot does for a narrative, right? Setting gives us the context, right? It tells us where this story is happening. Sometimes it gives us conditions. If we think of like an issue setting frame, it tells us what kind of setting we're working under, where the narrative is going to take place and which direction it's going to go. And plot is what positions us in time, right? It gives us kind of the temporal dimension of a story. And so we kind of draw, again, that connection between conditions and setting and plot. And then this is where things got a bit trickier. And so I think both Mike and I would be very quick to hesitate on like how strongly we feel about the deontic or else components because they don't map onto the NPF as clearly as the other three do. But we think that they matter to NPF elements, and we think that they actually matter to NPF content elements. And this is kind of where we have like the aha moment of maybe this is where narrative content plays out. So when we think about like the or else component of ADICO, it's about consequences, right? It's about what happens if a rule is broken. In a narrative, we see that kind of consequence play out in narrative mechanisms or causal mechanisms. And we really see it when it comes to like blame, attributing blame, hypervillainization. And so there could potentially be synergy there. For the deontic part, this is really specifying what's permitted, obligated, or forbidden. That's what belief systems tend to do in narratives. We see a lot of belief systems like cultural theory kind of set this framework within a narrative of what is allowable action, what is an acceptable kind of outcome of a narrative, what is kind of the general kind of framework of how characters would interact under a certain cultural frame. And so again, we think that there might be this overlap. And then I think in the paper, we're pretty clear that it might not just be one kind of content element. There might be an interaction of content elements that kind of frame or interact with those two components. And so after we kind of started mapping out kind of these ADICO components and put them next to each other, we've begun to kind of build that pattern, right? So we look at institutional strategies, institutional norms, and institutional roles, and what that might mean for the NPF. So when we look at AIC, so institutional strategies, we kind of argue that those are going to be what are going to be the lower narratives, right? We're going to look at just form elements, right? Attributes, aims, and conditions match on to characters, moral of the story, plot, and setting. That makes sense for a strategy in an institutional setting because it's that general kind of framework, right? It's also the general building block of a narrative. So it's kind of those minimum parameters to have an institutional statement and also the minimal parameters to have a policy narrative. And then when we add in those deontic or else components and we look at norms and institutional rules, that's probably going to be associated with higher levels of narratives because you're going to have the addition of those content elements. And then kind of in doing that, we argue that narratives are probably going to be influential in defining those kind of later components of ADICO, but also they're probably going to be important when it comes to actually interpreting and communicating institutional norms and rules. So kind of on that flip side, it's possible that narratives are not just the content of the rules, like defining kind of the structure of what these rules look like, but they're also really important in kind of internalizing and acting upon these norms and rules. So if we do see these patterns where deontic or else components are associated with like strong narrative strategies, that might be the reason why we see some rules or some norms being more or less supported, right? We see maybe more adherence or more acceptance of these, where we might see more opposition if somebody has a different kind of belief system or doesn't buy a causal mechanism. And so we kind of see that that relationship might be a bit different. So what we end up doing is we propose 4 kind of theoretical propositions in this paper. And so these propositions kind of come from the general conversations around NPF and IAD and kind of some of those overlaps we see with ADICO and NPF elements. So the first proposition is really looking at narratives as kind of preludes to the formal codification of rules. So this proposition argues that narratives are not just afterthoughts in policymaking, rather they play a critical role in the pre-rule stage, right? The narratives help define attributes, aims, and conditions in institutional rules by establishing who the key actors are and what position they play within an institutional setting. So the key kind of insight here is that narratives likely influence not just the perception of the rules, but how those rules are actually formulated. Because it sets the stage of kind of what is the predominant narrative going into kind of a rule formation. Proposition 2 looks at narratives as kind of the contextualization or the perception of these rules. So this proposition really highlights kind of the interpretive role of narrative, so kind of what happens after a rule is formed. And we say that narratives are probably important for shaping how rules are understood and enforced. While formal rules kind of might specify certain actions, the narrative surrounding that rule is probably going to give it more meaning to the audience. So it might be a good, it might be bad, but it's going to add kind of that needed cognitive processing that happens when we establish rules. And then Proposition 3 was looking at narratives as informal rules. So we wanted to address kind of the informal institutional settings as well. And here we kind of argue that institutional narratives likely function as informal rules because they embed that shared belief system, right? They give us norms, they help add value to the institution. And so unlike formal rules, which really are explicitly codifying a rule, informal rules probably rely on narratives a lot more than formal rules do. And then finally, proposition 4, we say that there's this feedback loop that exists between narratives and the established rules, right? Once narratives influence rulemaking, once a rule is made, narratives help us communicate that rule and internalize and process that rule, and that's going to feed back into the kind of the system. And we model that here. So we say that we have competing narratives, and whatever the winning narrative is going to probably influence kind of the institutional strategy, the overarching statement that the institution makes. And then when we add those narrative content elements, we might get the institutional norm or the institutional rule, depending on kind of how well accepted that is. that might feed back into more kind of narrative disagreement or narrative debate, and kind of this process continues. So, like I said, we did not do any empirics on this. We gave like a little illustrative example of what that might look like. But I am working on doing that right now. So currently, I'm coding data from all affirmative action cases in the Supreme Court. So I'm looking at higher ed affirmative action, and I'm coding all of the opinions. So majority, dissenting, plurality opinions. I'm coding the syllabuses, and I'm also coding the amicus briefs or the amicus briefs for the most recent Supreme Court cases that overturned affirmative action. And what I'm doing is I'm looking for these syntactic patterns, right? So I'm looking at the actual text, and I'm looking for NPF elements. I'm looking for rule types. And I haven't started the ADICO coding yet, but I will be kind of looking for those components as well. And so I kind of have two main questions that are going on. One is kind of looking at narrative migration. So what do the narratives look like in the amicus briefs? What are kind of the dominant narratives? And how does that play out in the outcome of the opinions? Do we see the structure of those narratives making up the structure of the institutional rules that are established in Supreme Court cases? And then do we also see that narrative migration in the dominant narrative of those opinions as well? And then we're just trying to track also the empirical relationship between narratives and rule configuration. So kind of just basic empirics of, are there statistically significant relationships between narratives and kind of these institutional grammar components. And so this is what we're looking at right now. If people have questions, I'm happy to speak to it a little bit. Still very much deep in the coding, so I won't be able to say too much about what patterns I'm seeing right now, but I have seen a little bit of interesting kind of phenomenon going on. So with that, I will end there, and we can go to questions. Thank you.